Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 199. Yes, who'd have thought we'd have got this far? So next week, of course, it's the big 200. Stick around and I will be telling you all about that later on in the podcast. But today we are going to be talking about the notion of group photography. If you found photographing one person difficult enough, then how on earth are you going to photograph several in the same moment? This is something that Viji from India has asked me specifically to talk about. So that's what's going to be on the discussion today. But right now we happen to be live here on YouTube. Leave me a comment. Tell me who you are. Tell me where you are. Tell me what the weather's doing. Get the chat going and we'll make a start. So yes, welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. As I say, today we're going to be talking about the notion of group photography. Lots of that coming up, and I will be telling you about next week as well, the 200th episode, and what I've got in store for that, and along with a couple of other things that will be happening in July. So make sure you stick around for that. But right now, you can, if you've not already done so, make sure you subscribe. Click the like button as well. The algorithms always like that. Tell your friends about this as well. Meanwhile, I can see we've got a few people in already. Meg says good afternoon. April says greetings from a hot and partly sunny Long Island, New York. Supposed to have severe storms today. Well, I hope you don't have anything too bad, or certainly nothing that knocks out your internet. I'd hate to think the storms were so bad you couldn't watch this. Robert says howdy all from Texas, sunny and mild. Susan says hello from a lovely sunny day in Kakubri, just back from a daily walk, and it was wonderful to feel the sun on my back. Yes, it finally does feel almost like summer's arrived. Still slight bite in the wind, but actually no, it's a rather nice day today. Not quite sure it's reached as high as 20 degrees, but certainly in the upper teens Celsius. April says, that's just April chatting away to Susan. Janet says, hello from a warm Mississauga. We're expecting storms today, but only around noon, which is currently 10 o'clock there. Susan, alright, so Susan and Janet Nadia joins us and says, hi everyone, in the car heading home. Obviously not driving. Nice that you can tune in while you're sitting as a passenger. That's kind of fun too. I don't know what the signal will be like. Generally speaking, in Scotland, it all depends which valleys you happen to be in as to whether you get the signal or not while you're moving. Right, okay, so we have a few people in, and we're certainly getting a better sense of what the global weather picture is like. So let's talk about today then. So today is the notion of group photography. So this came in from Viji. So, let's just tie this in. This is to do with smug points. Viji won the first quarter of smug. She accumulated the most smug points between January the 1st and the 31st of March in these episodes. And for anybody who's unfamiliar, or anybody who's just tuning in or is watching some kind of recorded back episode and going, what on earth are smug points? Smug points are points that I give out for contributions to this podcast. It's because this podcast is about you, the viewer. I mean, I can sit here and chat fine, but it doesn't really, it's just me talking to myself if I don't actually have anybody listening or contributing. And these podcasts are all about you. This is to help you improve your photography. But I can only really do that if I understand what it is you're wanting help with. So there are smug points. You're given 5 smug points if you happen to be watching live and you leave a comment so that I know you're watching live. Then you get 5 smug points straight off the back. Just straight away, 5 smug points for turning up. They're not a bad go, that. But then there's that notion, if you contribute, if I do a challenge and you put a picture in for the challenge, and you get 10 smug points for that. And then whenever I do a challenge, I have a first, second and third choice as well, which get an additional 10, 20 or 30 smug points. If you put in an image for critique, feedback, then I'll give you a bonus 25 smug points. And if you invite a friend along and then they join in, then you get a bonus 30 smug points. So basically, you see, smug points are all built around this idea of contribution to the podcast. The more you contribute, turning up, saying hello, chatting, putting images in for feedback, putting images in for challenges, coming up with ideas for podcasts, then you gain smug points. And then these smug points can be cashed in. Those who accumulate the most smug points in a month, they get to choose the next challenge. And those who accumulate the most in a quarter, across 3 months, they get to choose the entire topic for a podcast. The podcast gets turned over specifically to them. Now, it can be just purely reviewing that person's pictures, or it can be doing a deep dive into a topic that they specifically want to know about. And in this case, here we are. Today's podcast is about group portraits because of Viji. Viji won the accumulated smug points for the first quarter, and it's taken a little while to get round to it, but now we're going to be talking about group portraits. In fact, actually, it looks like Viji's arrived. It says, "Good evening, friends." So glad you could make it, Viji. So April and Susan also saying hi to Viji. Okay, so where are we at then? So if basically this notion of group portraits, generally speaking, when you take a portrait, there's the notion of you're trying to, what is a portrait? A portrait is essentially trying to convey something about a person. Now, it can just be about a likeness, but hopefully you're looking for beyond a likeness. When we think of a passport photo, an identification photo, that tells you what the person looks like, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything much about the person. So we tend to think of a portrait as describing some aspect of their thought, their mood, their action, maybe. So it's about a person, but it's usually something a bit more. It's something that's giving us a little bit of information about that person. Now, a group portrait is also likewise going to have the same kind of definitions. You can be about who's there, it's identification, and a lot of group portraits are primarily about identification. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. But it can also be about the mood of the group. It can be about the interaction between people. And this is a key thing of group portraiture, of group photography of any kind. That you can have one person, and that's one person on their own. But at the moment you enter a second person, there is now a dynamic. There is a relationship between one person and the other person in the photo. Whether you want it or not, it is there. If the two people are looking at each other, if the two people are looking in different directions, if the two people are looking at the camera, you as a viewer can't help but make comparisons or try and read the situation about the relationship between the two people that are in it. Similarly, if you then enter a third person into that, there's now a three-way dynamic, a four-way, five-way, seven-way, 10-way, 100-way. There's a whole load of things that are going on. And the more people that are in that picture, the more complex. There's a kind of exponential growth in complexity of things that can be read. And for you and for me, the photographer, the more tricky it can be to try and really establish some kind of sense whereby everybody in that photo has their own individual story, but it also sits in and fits within that group. One of the things I talk about in photography an awful lot is this idea that everything in that photo is either contributing to or detracting from the primary narrative of that photo. So what is it you're trying to achieve with that photo? And then when you've got people in it who are unpredictable, quite often don't want to be there, have their own mood swings or distractions or anything else, how do you ensure that the maximum number, you've got the best chance that each person is contributing to that whole photo and you don't have somebody detracting from it? And quite straightforwardly, it's difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And it's something that a lot of people avoid doing if they can possibly do so. Wedding photographers who specialise in group photography will have endless nightmares about this. Press photographers likewise. So, where are we at? Where are we going to start with this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through, I'm going to talk about some key aspects to group portraiture. And what I'm also going to do is show you examples of work that I've done on different groups. And so what we're going to be talking about is essentially there are, 3, 5, half a dozen different aspects to portraiture that I really want to talk about. So one is about that notion of relationship with people. The other is well, other things I'm going to be talking about are the sort of psychology of it. Really, I suppose, yeah. You can briefly break it down into, you've got the psychology, the people, the mood, the feeling, that what people are thinking at the other side of the camera, and you've got the composition. So what are the compositional tools that make a photo look slightly more interesting? Now these things are going to get mixed up a little bit throughout the podcast, but ask questions, leave comments, let me know your thoughts. I'm going to show you photos. If there's something you want to ask about that photo or comment about that photo, leave a comment. I've got my tablet on the side here, so hopefully I can see the comments as and when they come up, rather than me having to flick back through the screens as well. And this week I've remembered to put it on mute as well. Likewise, compositional techniques. And hopefully at the end of this podcast, you will have a much deeper understanding of how you go about approaching it. So, where do we start? Okay, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to run you through. Sandra sent me through a couple of images, specifically because the group portraits and where she's running into problems. Viji also sent me through a few images. So what we'll do first is we'll look at the images that have been sent through, and we'll talk through the questions that are being raised. And then what I'll do is I'll go through examples of photos and hopefully address these issues. By the time we get to the end of this podcast, you'll have this much better understanding of what's going on. So if I go over here, and let's start with Sandra's images. And Sandra just sent me two images, and that's fine because they basically give us, this is a starting point. So if we flip over to here, and Sandra said, as I have taken group portraits at Notting Hill that weren't particularly good, I attach a couple from 2022, which I was hoping you might critique as part of the Group Portraits podcast. And another question I have is about using reflected natural light when shooting portraits outside. Okay, well, just a quick thing about reflected light. You're right, when you're shooting outside, sometimes the light isn't always where you want it. If you can get a little bit of bounce light back in to help fill in the shadows, that's really good. But bounce light, reflected light, is something either you have a big reflector that you can hold up, or you have a friend who can hold a reflector, or you use something which is already there, like a bright wall or window or something like that, where the sun is hitting and bouncing off it. Okay, and that's a really, so essentially if you're outdoors and you've got a chance to take, whether it's a single portrait or group portrait, you need to be aware of the surroundings, of the area around you, and go, okay guys, just come over here, let's stand you here, because the light is coming in from this direction, but it's also bouncing off the wall over there. Okay, so that will kind of help. So reflected light is certainly something, but for that, either you hold up a reflector, or you have somebody holding a reflector, or you look for environmental places where there is more light reflecting off a large rock surface, you know, pale, or wall, or window, or something like that. Okay, reflected surface, but that will be something we can talk about again, and maybe it's something I might even address in a single podcast at some point in the future. However, for now, you've sent in this one, and you sent in this one as well. So two group portraits. Now, the immediate problem that you're up against is background. Okay, you've got no real control, quite apart from light and whether you are happy with the light or you're not. Essentially, your background is a major problem here. So here you've got these lovely four women here, all brightly coloured, bright pink, covered in sparkles, greens, oranges, absolutely fluorescent, but you've essentially got somebody photobombing in the background as well. So this person here obviously isn't part of this group, but because of the gap between these two, this woman here is now immediately a part of it. We've also got this guy, though he's leaving the picture, is very dominant in the picture. So cropping, just straightforwardly cropping in a little bit would allow you to get rid of that. But for this person here, unless you want to start mucking around in Photoshop and taking them out, your immediate problem is the fact that you've got the gap. And this is going to come back to a point which is where I'm going to talk about the notion of containment, and composition, but also the notion of gaps. Okay, and the problem that we have, and in fact I may as well address this now because it's worth talking about, to remind anybody here that one of the problems is with photography is gaps become exaggerated. So if I hold my phone next to my head here, now under normal circumstances, this, if you were in the room with me, you would be seeing from somewhere over there to somewhere over there in the field of view. And this bit here would only be taking up about 5 or 10% of the image. But if you think about the way this is framed in here, then actually this here is taking up something like about 20% of the image. From the side of that to the side of my face, this gap is now 20% of what the entire width of this screen. And if the image was cropped here and here, then this would be taking up something like about 35 to 40% of the screen. So as soon as you get it, the closer you are in, the bigger the gap appears to be. Okay, so the ancient war cry of wedding photographers everywhere is closer, closer. You've all been in that group photo where the photographer's yelling out closer, closer. And basically you need to squeeze people together to a point whereby they feel almost uncomfortably close to each other, because you're trying to get rid of those gaps. Okay, because the gaps just look wrong in 2 dimensions in a photograph in a restricted border. So that's one of the key things here. You also have the other thing, which is if there's a lot going on in the background and you have a gap, then you have this immediate problem here with the background sneaking in and interfering with. So if we're talking about things either contribute to or detract from, then the woman behind in the gap here is detracting from the people that you're supposed to be taking a photo of. Over here, what we also have is we've got these women here in their black, golden, black, orange and green, all smiling away. You've got the lad here who's leapt in. Now he's wearing the same colour, so I presume he's part of the same troop, although he looks like he's photobombing. Then the way he's leapt in, there's a woman behind here, looks like she's holding up her, maybe her sandwich, I don't, sorry, let's flip back here. Suddenly realised I've been chatting away without actually showing the picture. Let me just flick back, oh, wrong one. Back here then, just talking about the notion of this woman here as being in the gap. Okay, so coming out of that notion of gaps, still going the wrong way. Right, so back here we have so what it looks like is the key aspect is these women here, but this guy looks like he's photobombing. I assume because he's wearing the same colour scheme that he is part of the group, but he sort of looks the way this lot are all together. This guy is taking up a third of the photo, all of himself, and then he's standing in front of this woman. But I don't know whether this woman is part of the group or not. She looks like she's holding up a sandwich in a brown paper bag. She might, but he's got a brown paper bag too, but then he's got a drink. So presumably they're having their lunch or some kind of snack or something, but these women don't. So are they part of the group? They could be part of the group, but it doesn't feel very well balanced either. So again, in worrying about the background as well, we've got this huge poster up here, major piece of advertising, great for the advertisers, but it's pulling away from your picture. So again, you would crop in something like this, and I don't know how much you would crop this person out. We also have a problem with the fact that this woman here definitely looks like she ought to be part of it, but she's being blocked out as well. So these are the problems that you run into. So we've all had this problem. We're trying to take a photo of someone or a group of people, and some people are getting blocked out, other things are interfering. So in a way, your pictures here, Sandra, I'm sure everybody can identify with the problems of doing group portraits. And what we're going to be talking about across the rest of this episode is ways to hopefully get past that. Now, we'll move on to Viji's photos here as well. She says, I've enclosed some group photos this week. I always felt challenged while taking photos. Let's just flick back up for a moment. She says, so there's 3 aspects that Viji talks about. She says, first of all, people who pose for photographs are generally mostly friends or relatives. And then you show them the photo, and basically the first thing they do is they look at themselves. And this is true. When somebody looks at a group photo, because this is a big key part of group photography, is generally speaking, when you're taking a photo of a group, afterwards everybody's going to want to know what they look like in the group. And they don't really care what anybody else looks like in the group unless somebody's really destroying the whole picture because they're doing something funny. Mostly they care about themselves. So they're going to be slightly pissed off if, you know, everybody else in the photo looks great, but they figure they don't. So if you stick up the photo and they happen to be the one that's blinking or yawning or pulling a face or or they've just positioned themselves in such a way that they look like they're twice the size of everybody else, or for whatever reason, or some aspect of themselves that they don't feel particularly comfortable showing has then suddenly become exaggerated within the photo. Everybody, then they're going to be kind of a bit upset about it. Now, you're already up against this. We have talked before about the problem of people's faces being in reverse, right? We are used to seeing ourselves in the mirror. So when we see a photo of ourselves, the image we're used to is suddenly flipped to the other way, and it looks wrong. We don't have symmetrical faces, so everybody in the group photo looks like you're expecting them to, except you. You feel you don't look right in it. And so even under the best of circumstances, even when you've got a great group photo where nobody's blinking, nobody's yawning, everybody's clearly in view, everybody's smiling, everybody's doing everything you want them to, still for the most part, most people are not going to like that photo because they think they don't look that great in it. So you're already up against it, okay? Now, I'm going to come back to that moment, that in a moment. Okay, let's go back to what Viji's continually saying. So one thing Viji's concerned about when she's taking photos, that everybody's concerned about their own bit. What can you do about that? She also wants to know about how you can arrange people so it doesn't look like school group photography. What are the key points you need to keep in mind? So these are the compositional things that we're also going to talk about. Then she sent me 3 photos to show us examples of where things maybe worked or maybe didn't. So if we go back to here, then the black and white one was taken candidly while my team awaited an event. The photo was taken without their knowledge. Okay, now that's a pretty amazing thing to do, because one of the things you're generally speaking up against when you try and do candid group photography is it's almost impossible to get everybody arranged in such a way that you can see everyone, and yet in this one you've managed to do it. So that, I would say, was a lucky break. Your second one, you said this one was supposed to be candid, but one of my colleagues caught me in action. So here we've got the sort of candid one, but somebody, everybody else is involved, looking at whatever this guy's trying to show on his phone, but he's clocked you. Okay, so he's now looking. But there's a kind of fun element to that, and sometimes that idea where everybody's looking at something or doing something, but one person's looking at the camera, can be an interesting device. And I'll show you some more examples of that later on. And finally, Viji also sent me this photo, a family photo, where she said. The other one, I arranged for my family to take the photo, but my mum was busy watching her grandson rather than the camera while her grandson was busy staring down. So again, how do you arrange the photo? So we're trying to get a nice little group here. The wee boy isn't bothering to look at the camera, and mum is probably too busy looking at the boy and has got distracted and isn't looking at the camera as well. So we can see here then that there are a lot of different issues that are kind of coming to the fore. And I say Viji's added in another comment here which says people always tend to hide. Yes, there's always going to be a certain number of people who are going to hide as well. So we're up against it, right? We're up against this notion of the group photography. So what we're going to talk about then is essentially there's two kinds of group photography. In the sense that there's the group photography where, now some of the stage narrative stuff that you see I do, where I take people and I arrange them very specifically to tell a story, to tell a narrative, maybe create a scene of some kind. And I use people in an almost kind of still life kind of way. I'm looking very much for leading lines and diagonals and an overall composition and a mood and a feel for the story. And the people are players in the story. And that's a key kind of thing. But everybody on board knows that they have a role within it and are very clear about the role and are usually happy to be in that role. Now, everything I've just said should apply to the other kind of photography, which is you've got a group together, group of friends, group of family, you've got very short amount of time, and you've suddenly got the camera and you've got to take the group photo. And the real difference here is that you don't have much time. Nobody's going to give you 2 or 3 hours of moving around with lights, of playing around with costumes, of setting up backdrops, of doing all this kind of stuff. You tend to literally have little more than a couple of minutes if you're lucky. So what happens when we end up with these kind of photos? So let me run you through some kind of typical examples. Now sometimes the group can end up huge, okay? So let me start here with this one of the biggest group photos I've ever taken. Okay, so this was my friends Ruth and Gavin. Okay, so Ruth and Gavin, this couple in the middle here. Gavin, Ruth, they got married. They've been together for years, but they decided to have a wedding, and they had a big sort of festival. They live out in the country a little bit. They turned over a field. People came and camped. They had these tents and marquees. And it was a music festival. They're both highly skilled, world-class musicians. And so it was essentially almost like 4 days of different tents playing music sessions and all the rest of it. And it was a wonderful time. And they decided to get married, and they invited a whole load of people to come and witness them getting married, and had this big fun event. Now I was invited along, not as a photographer, I was invited along as a friend. However, I can't go anywhere without taking a camera with me, and I was firing off a few snaps, and actually during the ceremony I took some photos of them as well, which they were very pleased about. But at some point somebody said, oh, we've got to get a photo of everybody here. And there was another guy who'd been asked if he could do it, and he just sort of went deathly pale at the idea of trying to photograph this. And then suddenly he was looking at me and other people were looking at me, and I thought, but this isn't really me, except for the fact that there was nobody else essentially to do the job. So it was down to me. Okay, so essentially I just said, right, okay, everybody gather here. There were some benches, which a couple of people, which essentially this front row sat on. And in a way, everybody kind of organised themselves. We said, well, okay, we're doing it here. Everybody gather round here. So there were those who sat on the benches, a bunch of people who sat down at the front, people who stood behind, and then other people who stood behind, then a few people who stood on some chairs behind. How can you organise 100+ people? The reality is you can't, really. You do your best. I fired off several photos, and this was the best of the photos that I took. However, within this group, and the key thing for me was to make sure that Gavin and Ruth were both looking at the camera and smiling and weren't blinking. Okay? Now, that's not true of everybody here. If we go through, we can count, there's a cap behind here. Somebody's out of sight. This person blinking, this person laughing, this person looking down. Kids are generally okay. This person could, a couple of blinkers down the front here. Somebody getting lost back there. Somebody just vaguely peering through in the background. And the more you kind of examine it, the more you tend to find that there are people where you see a hint of a bit of hat somewhere. You notice that there are some people who just didn't make it in. We've got the back of a head here. We've got another blinker there. Got somebody who's looking over in that direction. This person here, this woman has grabbed her child. The child's head is now in front of her own face. Pete here is busy blinking. Oh, there's a stray hat at the back there. Okay, and actually there's a blonde hair as well. So there's two people there who didn't make it into. Somebody here who's just part of an eye, top of a hat or a bit of hair there. So I clearly wasn't able to get everybody. I got enough people that Ruth and Gavin can go, this is great, we have a nice set of people, but not everybody was there. Now, one of the things I shouted out, and is always a good thing to do when you're talking to people about group photography, is you have to say to people, if you can't see the camera cannot see you. If you can't see the camera with both eyes, the camera cannot see both your eyes. So if you want to have the record in 10 years, in 20 years, when we look back at these photos, and you want to be able to say, yes, I was there, or for anybody else to say, yes, you were there, you need to be able to see the camera with both your eyes. Okay, and you explain it, something like that. You say it with a smile, you say it with a laugh, but that's the message you're trying to get across. And then if somebody really desperately wants to just hide behind everybody else, genuinely, there is nothing you can do about it. Not with 100+ people. I can't take all the photos. I can't go around and correct everybody. I can't sit down and talk to everybody. I don't have the time. And nobody else has all the patience to hang around while I do that for a handful of individuals either. So there's a certain amount of compromise, there's a certain amount of you just do the best you can, okay? But understand that the bigger the group, the more problematic it's going to be for you. So what's this? Okay, comments. Viji says lovely pic. April says natural picture. Viji says this many people and you still manage to get everyone. Like you say, not necessarily everyone. And as April says, they may have done that on purpose. Yes, hiding behind is definitely something people do on purpose. Okay, very rarely are you going to be having to photograph that many people. But even, here's another family photograph. So this was a family gathering. We went down to the beach, took a few photos of everybody on the rocks, but also then let everybody run around, and I took sort of pictures of people lobbing stones into the sea, wading through rock pools, smaller groups and stuff like this. But this was the main group where, so this was for Shirley here, and Shirley had the family gathering. And so the family gathering, and then there was somebody who couldn't be there, so Shirley had a photo of the person who couldn't be there. But we wanted to get this photo, and so this photo is them sitting on the rocks. But even with this one, even at with the best thing, we can see this woman over on the right really didn't want to be in the photo, and certainly, I mean, balance-wise, she should have been over here. She should have been to the left of this guy, and then that would have sort of sat nicely and created a much better balance, except for the fact she was desperate to hide behind someone. And then we have the problem with the fact that layer 1 is right in front of the rocks, and layers 2 and 3 are then sitting up on the rocks, and she didn't really feel up for climbing on the rocks either. Now, this one was, and a couple others that I took around the time, were all done fairly quickly. As you can see, there's lots of coats and hats on. This is the middle of winter in Scotland. It's down at the beach, and it's cold, right? Everybody's wearing these jackets for a reason. Right, and you can also see by the way the hair's blowing, there was a bit of a breeze as well. So nobody wanted to be spending 20 minutes while I arranged everybody about. Sometimes you've just got to do the best you can. However, what I do have in this picture is the fact that everybody is looking at the camera, nobody's blinking, and so, you know, this was the best of the ones that I had. It would have been nice if I could have got this woman to stand over here, but she was just quite determined to hide behind somebody else. And at that point, you also kind of have to give people that, you know, because just to get her in the photo in the first place is more important than her deciding she's just not going to be in the photo because she can't stand to be there. You know, never underestimate just some of the huge barriers some people will have against being photographed. And you can think all our reasons are unnecessary, misplaced, misjudged, but unless you're going to spend several hours with them, you're not going to have the time to do all those psychological things to relax them enough to put them in front of the camera. When I'm doing single portraits of people, that's exactly what I do. Single portraits, I spend a lot of time with people to help get them past all their fears and anxieties of being in front of the camera. And I do a lot of work long before we ever get round to taking photos that are going to be used. But in a situation with a group photo like this, you do not have the time to do that. So you are making compromises. And certainly for Shirley, the fact that this woman is in the photo is more important to her than the fact that it is perfectly balanced. As the photographer, I would have preferred her over here and had a much better balanced photo. But it was more important that she was in the photo than the photo was perfectly balanced. Okay? So, hold on a sec, that I just realised one of these pictures has been numbered wrong. So where am I going to put that one? Let's do that. That should be 28, right? Okay. Now, one other thing I will talk about with group photos where we've kind of deliberately taken a big group photo that is the notion of sometimes how do you fit people into a space. Now, we had this one where we were out in a field. It was big enough to be able to get several layers of people in and stand back. Sometimes though, you're in a much smaller environment and there isn't the space to do that. And one of the things you can do is, if you can get up high, I've seen photos of people where what they've done is you've had, essentially had like the wedding photographer up on the sort of second floor or even third floor of the building, of the hotel maybe, or the venue, looking down, and then they've had everybody gathered in the courtyard below looking up. And at that point, with everybody looking up, you're seeing all the faces. You're getting everybody into the shot. You can see all the faces, and and you're not having, and so in a much smaller space comparatively, you can fit everybody into the shot. Now, I've not actually got one of those on record that I can show you that I've done, but I have one which is actually the reverse of that, which is shooting up, which is this one. So we're actually shooting up the stairs. On this particular occasion, I was doing a photo shoot. I was doing film stills. So there was a micro-budget horror film being shot down in Kipford, not far from here, in this house, 1970s. The fact that it all still had the 1970s wallpaper, carpets, furniture, fixtures, and everything else was part of the film set, and they wanted a group shot of all the people, not just the actors, but the camera people and the sound people and the technicians and the producer and everybody who was involved in the shoot. And we realized that actually one of the ways we could do it was to get everybody going up the stairwell. So essentially I lay on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, and then everybody leaned over, and then again, the only way to light them, I've got a flash on the camera shooting up, so we've got the shadows on the ceilings behind. It's maybe not the most perfect of perfect photos, but it was fun enough. Generally speaking, I would prefer to shoot from above down below, but you can see the way the staircase narrows at the top, that actually I couldn't do it the other way around. If I was shooting from above, then I wouldn't get everybody who was on this side. The only way to get everybody in to such a small space was to essentially shoot up, and then this way we've got everybody in. Now, worth saying at this point, a little bit of detour, but certainly worth saying, remember that if you are doing a photo shoot whereby you are shooting that you've got layers, that people are in more than a single line, then you've got to have a narrower aperture, you've got to have a deeper depth of field, okay? And something you've got to be really aware of. There's no point in going wide aperture and then finding half the people are out of focus. That there's only one line of people on focus, and the people in front and the people behind are all out of focus. So make sure you're going for a narrower depth of field, to a narrower aperture. To give you a deeper depth of field. But that, of course, tends to mean you need more light as well. So you might end up using flashes or whatever. But for outdoors, it tends to be slightly easier. Okay. April says that's cool, and Viji says that's really cool. Okay. So then there's this note. Let's talk a little bit then about. So these ones are all posed. These are where people are, people all know they are being photographed. But Viji was also asking about the notion of candid photos. Can you do kind of candid group photos? And to be honest, they're really, really difficult. Now, she managed to get the lovely set of silhouettes of people waiting, but that feels very, very opportunist. This is probably one of the best I really quite like. So I was doing a photo shoot with models. We were at the hairdressers. We can see that we've got our makeup artist here, we've got our model, we've got the two hairdressers working on them, and then the makeup artist herself is taking a photo of the model on her phone so that she's got a record of what she's doing with the makeup. And while that was happening, I then took a photo of them in action. And so I took it, so these were the kind of behind the scenes shots. And sometimes if you're doing these behind the scenes shots, you can find interesting group combinations. But it's not easy because, if she's a little bit further back, he's gone forward, she's moved forward, the light is slightly tilted. Trying to get all the elements so that they work together is extraordinarily difficult because it's random. You can't play. If you see the gap, you can't say, hold on a minute, can you just move over left a bit and plug that gap? Because this is candid. This is not posed. This is catching people in action. And so your hit rate is likely to be much, much lower. So you have to be aware of that. You might have to take a lot more photos to get ones that, to be able to pick out the handful that actually maybe work. you've also got to learn to, like street photography, you have to learn to anticipate. You have to learn to kind of watch the movements of people and be ready for the camera so that by the time they move into position, you can go click. Because so often what happens is they're in a great position and you go, oh, that looks great. But by the time you go click, they've moved out of position and that beautiful bit of composition that you've noticed has gone. So candid group photography, again, exponentially more difficult for each extra person you have in it. Generally speaking, 3 people, 4 people, once you start getting about 5, it gets extraordinarily difficult indeed. Meg says, I like the diagonal curve on the banners in the last photo. Oh, okay, excellent. Now, another one here is sometimes what you do is you can try and get some kind of device. So like this, I was doing some photography for Earth's Crust Bakery. Well, it's a few years ago. In fact, you can see, in fact, courses back in 2018, they're doing artisan bread making courses. So 6 years ago, this photo was taken. But part of, I was sort of embedded in the day. I was doing some portraits, individual portraits when things got quieter later in the afternoon, but I was also doing some photos of people in action. And by standing at the end of the counter here, so we had clients queuing up and getting ready to pay here, we had servers and people on the till here. I'm kind of I'm finding a space whereby we can get people in. Now, in an ideal world, this woman here on the right would have been just a fraction further forward. But again, I can't really dictate to people when they're in the middle of doing a job. I'm looking for opportunity. So, but sometimes so if you're looking for that notion of the candid idea, you try and set up in a particular space whereby maybe the actual fixtures, fittings, geography of the street or the building or the courtyard or whatever actually help people, so these people here aren't going to move any further forward than that. These people here aren't going to move any further forward than that. But me looking down the counter allows to have people either side, but also to be showing off the bread in the middle and the kind of thing that's going on in the background, the fact that they do soup and bread and focaccias and quiche and coffee and all that. So that all becomes part of what's kind of coming into the photo. Okay, so hopefully then that's giving you a few kind of pointers to this notion of. So let's start talking about composition. Okay, now I would say there are 3 key aspects of composition when it comes to groups. Now, we've got lots of different compositional things that we've talked about with rule of thirds and asymmetry and all sorts of things. But the 3 that I would say that are most important for when you are doing group photography are containment, diagonals, and leading lines. Okay? Containment, diagonals, leading lines. And throughout the next set of photos that I'm going to show you, these things are going to apply. Now, maybe not all of them, but some of them or most of them, I will try to get. I try to get in, and I'll start actually with one that where it didn't work. Oh, April's saying I like the cafe picture. That's nice. So this one here, this is actually one of my most popular photos. This was a Peaky Blinders kind of themed shoot. It was so Peaky Blinders, for anybody who hasn't seen it, is a BBC production, and it's set in the 1920s Midlands, England, around Birmingham, and it's about a set of gangsters in the 1920s and or what have you. And here we're in an old ruined warehouse. I've got smoke bombs. I've got 10 people in period costume plus a horse. I've got lights and everything else. And so this photo ends up, it's a very popular photo because basically everybody's caught up in the content. They love the fact that everybody's all in costume and there's a horse and the lighting and the setting and the kind of ruined, the old kind of decay and the warehouse and everything else. And all those elements are great. And I'm pleased with those elements. But the one thing that bugs me every single time I look at the photo is the fact that everybody's in a straight line. And that everybody in a straight line, to me, is the worst of all group photo ideas. Just having everybody side by side, everybody more, there's not a lot of variation in height. If I took a line here, it would just curve slightly down, slight lift with the horse, slight lift with the tall guy here. Yes, and then everybody's feet is on a level and it feels very flat. It's compensated for a little bit by the fact that there's light behind them, by the fact that they're in a factory, that there's a bit of depth in the photo. But personally, straight line, everybody in a line, like a kind of firing squad, is pretty much the worst kind of composition you can have. I get away with it because everything else is interesting. But every time I look back at this shoot and I look back at those photos, I desperately wish that I had moved some of them forward, some of them back, and had them at different distances towards the camera. Even if they'd still been in a straight line, because I would, if some of them had been closer and some of them had been further away, it would have still made for a more interesting photo. But all on the same level, all in a line, I think is the worst of all possible outcomes. Okay, April says I thought the intention of the shot, and kind of it was, because I wanted to make sure they were all in the shot. But this was a case of afterwards I kind of felt like I could have done this differently. So let's move on. Let me show you. So here's another one where this photo shoot was done for the local high school. In their final year in high school, you had a group who had to words are escaping me at the moment. So they had an enterprise group. That was an enterprise group whereby they had to manufacture something and then sell it and raise money for charity, and then learn a whole bunch of business skills in the process. And this group was had created these kind of like paperweights and things out of concrete and metal and what have you. And we set up in so Ella up here, her dad is Adam Booth, who's a artisan blacksmith, so he's got a forge, he's got a blacksmith. So we set up in there and we made it all look very industrial, but also, because it's supposed to be enterprise, industrial and suits and everything else. And so we're playing around with lighting, we're playing around with things. I'm giving it a bit of an angle, getting everybody to look grumpy, or getting everybody to look serious into the picture. And we did this one, but again, I started feeling it was just a bit too flat. But given actually this was extraordinarily restricted space, there wasn't a lot I could do. We couldn't really push people much more forward and back within this. I was really cramped in. I've got a wide angle lens on this camera trying to fit everything in. But what we did was we got a bunch of tools out and got Adam to handle stuff. And we've got we've got tongs and a sledgehammer, and this looks like something out of Mad Max. So there's a whole bunch of tools going on, and now suddenly it's looking much more interesting. Okay, what I've done here is I've introduced diagonals in a big way. So if we go back to this notion of diagonals being the point whereby the diagonals add energy to a picture. When the dominant lines are vertical and horizontal, things tend to be calmer, tends to be more placid. And that's partly why I don't like everybody just standing in a line. It's too calm, really. It's not enough energy in it. There's not enough energy. Whereas when you introduce dominant diagonals, it ramps up the energy. What it also does is, because this tool then comes over the top of the anvil and sort of starts drawing it, and at that I've curved them a little bit more, we've now got a little bit more sense of depth. And the power of this one becomes much more, there's much more energy in this photo than there is in this one. You can go back to this one, and this one you can see by comparison feels quite calm, whereas this one has a lot more energy. This one, and what I really bring into, now again we've got everybody in a line, but what I'm using here is we're using the device of the table, and you will notice this cropping up quite a lot. There was an interesting little sideline here, a little bit of tangent. During Spring Fling, Susan from Kakubri came out to see me, and she said, one of the things I've noticed about some of your photos is they very often contain a coffee pot. Is that intentional? Is that like a signature piece? And we chatted about it and realised actually there's very few of my pictures actually contain a coffee pot. Maybe 3 or 4, but really not that many. I've got the coffee pot up there behind my head, but doesn't tend to crop up. But actually, Susan, if you've really been on the wall, you would have noticed that tables probably appear in far more of my photos than anything else, especially group photos. I'm very fond of a table with a group photo. And a table is a device for actually pulling people together. It's why it crops up so much in a lot of the old paintings. I mean, we know the Last Supper, Da Vinci's Last Supper, the most famous example of that. But if you look at almost any of the Dutch old masters, or right across the centuries, you'll very often find people gathered at a table, because a table's a good reason to have people together, because either they're discussing plans, in this case there's plans of maybe where they're going to invade or what they've got to defend, or it's got food and people are going to be eating, so there's a reason for people to be gathered. So tables are good devices. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about here is the notion of containment. You remember me talking, I've talked before about the notion of containment, which is that as you get towards the edge of a photo, you want to be able to get drawn back into the photo. You don't want people falling out the edge of the photo. Okay, so that notion of containment is that as the eye starts to stray across, there's a reason to bring it back in. We're in this sort of like dungeon part of this tower house here, and the curved roof, which has then, I've got a bit of light catching up on it, creates our very own containment. And then also what you do is the people on the edge of the table are looking back inwards. So as you drift over this way, you reach the monk on the left, and his eyes are drawing back in, so you immediately get swept back in. As you come over this way, you've got the priest, and the knight here immediately pulls you back this way. We've got a bard sitting down at the feet here, priest here holding a knife, which is also pointing back in. So every time you go off to the side, it swings you back round again. So that kind of acts as this containment kind of shot. Now, I've used this device then in a couple of other photos. Is that the one that I wanted to do? Okay, I've mixed up the order I was going to do that in. So let's show you that. I'll skip through here then. So you may remember that notion of this one, the 7 Deadly Sins of Chocolate, that I did again. So we've got a table, we've got people, and again, the way things were going, we kind of had to have them in a line. But we've got envy over here looking in, we've got greed over on the right looking back in. So as you move towards the edge of the table, you get pulled back in again. Now there's another thing that's going on here, which is about not having everybody at the same height. So now we're talking about kind of bringing in the diagonals again. We've got zigzags going on. We've got arms that are coming down at diagonals. This arm's coming down. We've got a face all the faces are at kind of different heights. Or if these 3 faces are kind of at the same height, that's okay, because they're broken up, because these 4 aren't. Okay, so now, as well as containment, we've got the use of diagonals going on. Some of you may remember this one as well, a group of artists at the nail factory. We're using the same techniques again. So the way the shadows are going, the shadows are darkening, so we're creating this sort of boundary containment with the shadows, but we've also got the table, but we have Caro over here. So as you come towards Ewan and Caro, you get swept back into the table this way. As you come round to Pete and Jeff, Jeff's facing back in this way. Again, we've got bits, he's weaving a bit of willow, which is pointed, when he's got a piece pointing out, pointing us back in here. Caro over on this side has got a paintbrush pointing this way. Erwin's jewelry thing for sizing rings and a little hammer are pulling us back in this way as well. So we've got leading lines and containment, and also there's a general kind of curve over here, but again, it's sort of zigzag in heights. We've not got people at the same heights. Okay, so this notion then of containment, leading lines, diagonals, mixing up the heights. These are the key aspects of photography. Now, let me go back to where I was going to come in here. One of the very first group photos I ever had to do was this one. And this one was a terrifying one for me to do, because this was in my early days of portrait photography. I'd not long been established, maybe 2 years or less. as a portrait photographer, and I was invited to join a group that was being formed called the Galloway Photographic Collective. So it was a collective of photographers. So all 7 of us here are photographers who live in the region. With different specialities, and the idea was that as a group we might be able to do maybe have access, we could do group exhibitions, we might get access to funding that we might otherwise not be able to do, we might be able to lend equipment to each other, pass on useful tips and information to each other. We weren't in competition with each other, what we were doing was there to kind of help each other. And it was being formed, and it was, right, we need a group photo. Kim, you're the portrait guy, you can do the group photo. Now, yes, I was the portrait guy, but I was used to doing portraits one at a time. Very occasionally doing a couple, but I just photographed one person at a time. So I had terrifying nightmares about doing this. The other problem with doing this shot was the fact that each time I went click, all the photographers wanted to come over and take a look at it and give me their advice as well. It's the worst thing. Photographers are the worst people of the lot to photograph because they want to tell you where you've gone wrong every time. However, I asked advice from a friend online who's a really good photographer who gave me advice about lighting and some bits about composition. So here then what we've got is we've got this kind of curve coming round. We've got 2 layers so that we're not doing the straight line. We've got three sitting in the seats, four behind. I'm sitting on a stool here. And this took a few different arrangements because one of the other problems was, in order for me to be in the shot, was we had to set it on a 10-second timer. I had to go click, run round, get into position. It all goes click, then go back. And then I realised that somebody's blinked or somebody's moved or whatever. So it took several attempts before I could kind of get this one right. Once we got this in the bag, a bunch of very serious looking photographers, we decided to have a bit of fun where we thought, well, okay, what if we just give everybody cameras and start pointing them at each other? And we did this one. Okay, so now everybody's in more or less the same position or in the same place in the photo, but we've all got different things going on. People, Phil here pointed the camera at himself, Roger, and I know his name. Annoying the hell out of me. Anyway, these guys pointing cameras at each other, him pointing at one at her, she's looking at her, looking into the back of hers. He's the only one looking into the camera. Which of course then suddenly makes Alan here look like he's the dominant one of the picture. Which is another kind of story you can tell. But this one though ends up being a fun kind of mix. It's both a pose shot, but it's a pose shot that's supposed to look candid, because everybody's kind of involved, like you've just caught everybody playing around. So there are fun kind of overlaps where you can kind of create that. But at the same, I mean, while it's supposed to look candid, we also know full well that it's posed at the same time. So that just adds a level of fun to it. Now, about 3 or 4 years later, we've been through various iterations. There have been some people who'd left, other people who joined, and it was time for another group shot. This one, what we decided to do was a different kind of thing. We went into the woods in the evening. It was quite dark. And basically what I did was I got everybody to hold an off-camera flash pointing at themselves or pointing at the group somewhere. And with that, then, when I set the timer to go click, it had the little trigger on it, and its flash triggered everybody else's flash. Needless to say, that wasn't easy. It was a bit of a technical nightmare and took several goes to try and get right. But it just felt like a bit of a fun kind of thing to do. So everybody's lit here by a flash that they're holding. Alan here now is just holding, his one is behind the tree, but he's pointing it at here. Roger's being lit by here. Giles here is actually, he's got lit on both sides because he's being partially lit by Alan's and partially lit by Roger's. In fact, everybody's kind of got lit slightly more on one side because depending on the angles that they're all going at. So that was a kind of fun one. But again, what we're talking about here is this idea of, because the lights are coming inwards, it's creating a bit of a containment. My arm is coming up just to make sure there's a bit of a barrier here. This tree is acting as a barrier over on this side. So we've got the containment, but we're also looking at the notion that we are not having a single straight line, that we have these diagonals going through it, which adds to the energy and break up that notion of the straight line. A couple of comments here. Meg says chocolates are very tempting, always. April liked the black and white photo. Viji liked the 7 deadly sins. And the black and white photo is so much fun too. And Viji says this one's quite creative as well. Okay, so where have we got to? We've done that. Okay, so now let's talk about this. So this is another one down on the beach. So we've got a group of people. Now this is all in a straight line. And again, earlier on when I took them while I was still there, I still hadn't really fully got to terms with the idea of mixing it up a little bit, but this was fine. At the time it just had everybody in line, but we've still got bits of containment, we've still got the zigzags, we've still got the diagonals, we've still got that notion of creating a sort of space within it and mixing it up so that not everybody's flat. But this is a band called Cafe Largo. I did this shoot for them. Well, I then did another shoot with them a couple of years later, which was this one. And you can now see that my understanding of kind of this group photo has changed, has moved on a bit. Now I've got a wide angle lens and I've gone down. This is on a stage. I've got a smoke machine going in the background, but I'm deliberately now playing up the notion of the angles. So we've got these sort of zigzags. He's holding this at an angle. We've got diagonals in there. Again, the people on the outside always facing in, so that it's helping to contain for that containment. So he's got his trumpet pointing in this way. She might have a saxophone there, but she's looking in this way. Again, we've got one guy who happens to be looking at the camera. This guy might be, we'll never know. The sunglasses just a bit too dark. But this then kind of creates this sort of containment. And this, I think, in terms of composition of your group, this notion of zigzags, leading lines, containment. Okay, diagonals, leading lines, containment. Just keep thinking of these things whenever you've got a group. Okay, those were the ones. Let's come back to this one. This one was for another group, the McMath project, and there's whole stories behind that. I can't remember if I ever actually did a podcast on this one. I might have. But what we're trying to do here is creating a very painterly kind of effect with it. Again, we've got a table, we've got instruments, we've got music, we've got books on a table, we've got a couple of people playing, these guys playing their instruments in the background, while we've got these people here looking at the book. So there was significance within each of the things that was going on. Lots of story behind it. But the main thing that, again, I want to talk about is we've got this kind of arched, sort of kind of triangle curved shape that you start noticing. That kind of, it contains everybody, but within that we've got these diagonals, we've got everything mixed up. I don't know that there's two people who've got heads at the same height. So that notion of mixing up the heights becomes really important. Okay, let's move through. We've got a couple more. Some of you may remember this one. Actually, let's move on to this one. Here's another example then of which I've talked before about kind of containment and also here we're using a kind of symmetry as well. We've always got a leaf shape to it as it comes round here, out with the girls' dresses and legs, and then kind of curves back up. And we've got two butlers. We've got the Lord and Lady, and then we've got their daughters here, and they're all within the library. So so very much then, this is very, very containment orientated. Everybody's looking kind of inwards into the picture. Okay, we've also got it mixed up that even though you've got that kind of mirror effect happening of poses and postures, nobody's at exactly the same height. So there's energy within this and containment. This one, similar one that was done, I think, a year or two before the other one, another enterprise, school enterprise group, where at this point they were making these cake stands out of vintage plates, and their theme they wanted to do was kind of Alice in Wonderland kind of theme. And again, you can see we're using the same kind of idea, so that the whole body shape and everything else is creating this contained, it brings it back in on itself. Okay. Now, very different kind of thing. This one was taken this year. I will be doing a talk about this particular picture probably sometime in the next month or two. It was a Cluedo or Clue in North America, I think is known as, but certainly in Britain it's Cluedo themed shoot. And again, we've got the table, we've got people gathered around the table, but rather than being flat onto the table in the way the Seven Deadly Sins were or the artists were, this one is diagonally into the table. Okay, so everything about this is about having these diagonals. There's very few absolute verticals or horizontals in the picture. Even where there might be a vertical, like the edge of the mirror frame over here, it's sort of tilted slightly, and that becomes exaggerated again because of a wide angle lens. Looking into the table, we've kind of got all these diagonals, we've got these kind of leading lines, the lead piping drawing our attention into here. Everybody's at slightly different heights and angles and lines and everything else. So that notion of diagonally shooting into the corner is a real way of adding energy, and it gives you a sense of depth. People are at different levels. Nobody's in a straight line here. So now we're moving to the point whereby you're about as far away from the straight line as you can possibly get. So with that in mind, you can be in the house. We can start moving around though, because now sometimes it's not always. So what's this? April says smoke machines add a lot. That's obviously talking about the band shot. She says, I like the composition with the warm environment and a movie portrait feeling in this. Yeah, this one I've very much gone cinematic with the crop, with the colour scheme, with the styling of it. You kind of get the feeling it's like a kind of high stakes poker game, except for the fact they're playing a board game. But I'll talk more about this maybe in another podcast, but I did want to show you and kind of the evolution of group portraits. This one taken a couple of years back. And so this is a band photo, but taken inside a pub in a bar. And we've got, again, people at different angles here. We've got a narrative going on, but again, we've got the containment. If you look, with this guy looking in at the cards, she's peeking over. The way the light comes in catches the edges. We've got the edges over here, and then Ken over here on his base. He's pointing inwards. This is coming up. Eric here is looking back towards him. We've got curves. We've got diagonals, we've got containment, and we've got everybody pretty much again at different heights. This one, a much older one, but you can take this idea. This was actually done on a plane. There's an aviation museum in Dumfries. This plane doesn't actually have any wings. But we used it for a photo shoot, and we had a bunch of people. So to make it look like a kind of cocktail party on a plane, and we're using the different layers of seats. The fact that woman in red is standing up. She's leaning over the seats. She's kind of sitting up a bit. Everybody's looking in and at each other. What else have we got? I mean, indoors, you can take it outdoors. Outdoors is another thing where you've taken this kind of domestic scene, table and sofa. And this one was done for a band called Kasama. And they wanted to make sure that they had these radio towers in the background. So we went up into the hills, and you can tell by the hair, on a very windy day. And set up a scene there where you're using the same props, the notion of chairs and tables, that domestic thing, but just putting it in a different environment. Or like this one, where it goes again. This was another year of a different year again of the school enterprise group. For 3 years in a row, I did photos for them, where we've got table, chair, sofa, lamp, standard lamp, and we're right down on the beach itself. But again, we've got two people sitting on the actual couch itself, one sitting on the arm, somebody behind. We've got these two interacting, these two interacting. We've got a general kind of shape that's kind of contained within here, but because she's looking, the one on the outside is looking inwards, this one on this outside is also looking inwards, it's containing it, it's creating this shape. But the other thing about this one, though, is we've got depth. And actually, I should say that was a thing about the last couple as well, is with this one, there's a sense of the plain behind them. With this one, we've got the towers in the distance. So the background is becoming quite important when we're playing with this. There's a sense of, even if the people themselves are only one layer deep, there's a much bigger sense of the sea behind them. We've got the diagonal, where the water line comes in, running through them, is taking us off to the hills in the distance. This is the ultimate one of a sense of depth. I use a picture of blood bikes. We've got all these motorbikes coming down here, and then again, the original talk of this, when we were talking about doing for blood bikes, was that we would have a guy with a motorbike delivering blood to a boy on a hospital bed, and this was going to be done in a hospital room. But then came the idea of, well, we really wanted to show that it's not just one guy on a bike, that there's a whole bunch of volunteers who take part in blood bikes. So we took the idea out of the room, placed it in an environment whereby we could really create a sense of depth. Now, in order to get this group portrait, I much like the kind of idea of being on the third floor and looking down, I was on a cherry picker in order to get the height to give me the space to take this photo. And so, where do we... now, so that's about the notion of depth, but there's also containment. Let's come back to this idea. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of, I like the sort of candid versus posed. So this was a little bit of doorstep photography I did for Lucy, Pete and LMA, and I cannot remember the name of the dog. So back during COVID and lockdown, when we were all socially distanced and not allowed to meet, there was a wee phase of doing doorstep photography where, as long as the weather was okay, I could stand a couple of meters away, a few meters back with a zoom lens and still do some family portraits. And doorsteps were actually I discovered were quite a good device for doing group portraits as well, because you had steps that you could sit people on, and you had a doorway which became a natural frame to kind of place people in. So that kind of thing, steps are always a good one. If you're at a place and you've got a group of people, you can get people and you can put them on different layers, different levels going back. So remember the idea of steps. This is just with 3 people, but if you've got 30 people, actually having them go back on 3 or 4 layers of steps is a really good one to remember as well. Yeah, April's just noticed that it just says the dog is not looking. Yeah, can't always get the dog to look. Now, what I wanted to say, I've got an almost identical photo of this one, which was taken at the same time, which is this one where they were. So here, Lucy's looking at the dog and Pete's looking at LMA, but LMA is looking at the camera, and it's going back to that notion of sometimes when you have one person looking at the camera, it creates kind of an interesting dynamic, so it's a mix of posed and candid, and sometimes that can work quite well. Because what happens actually is it really draws attention at this point to LMA. It draws attention to the wee girl, because now she's the only one who's actually engaged with us as the viewer. Sometimes though, you can also, I've played that to my advantage within doing band photos as well. This band I did, this was a photo called a band called the Ayres. This was for that album cover, and this guy here looking at us over the top of his glasses was the lead singer. Okay, and part of the story behind this one was the idea that he was a bit of a diva and the rest of the band members were always running around him. So we had this all set up, so he's lighting the cigar, he's pouring his coffee, he's combing his hair, while he is looking actually at us. And this is another part of the photo thing where you've got the relationship that's going on between the people, okay, and the relationship between each of the subjects in the photo becomes an important part of what's going on. Here's one from a little while back, me with my grandchildren. They're all much older now. But again, a fun little thing here, a little bit of containment. Again, we've got this sort of triangle-y, kind of round, contained shape. These two are facing outwards, but their heads are turned back inwards. We're all wearing the top hat and glasses. And the fun bit of that is that everybody's wearing the top hat and glasses, but we call Mac here. So sometimes when you're creating a group photo, you're looking for what's different, what stands out, what goes against the grain in a way. Whether that's you've got one person looking at the camera, or you've got one person who is interpreting the kit in a slightly different way. And then finally, last photo I want to show you is this one, again, an early shot of an earlier band I was in called Scruffy Buzzards, where what we've got here is you've got all the elements that I've been talking about, which is you've got a couple of layers. So we've got depth, we've got containment, me there with my bouzouki, curved back. We've got John swinging his bass round on the right, but we've got a lot of diagonals. There's a huge amount of energy in this. So, and if we're talking about that notion of relationship between the different subjects, this was about how band shots. So often with indie bands, all you ever see is four blokes against a garage door looking moody. So we decided to do four blokes against the garage door, beating each other up with the instruments. And it was a lot of fun, and this got a lot of usage. Got a lot of usage out of this photo. But if we then come back to, with all these ideas, just very quickly, to realise then that when we look at Sandra's photo of this one and this one, these ones, that it's about what, with this one, the background, it's very difficult. You've got to grab people in a moment. Sometimes you've just got to make sure that you can get everybody who needs to be in the shot, and then you try and frame it in such a way that the background isn't interfering with it, or likewise nobody's accidentally photobombing it. You try and make sure that the gaps are closer so that you're containing what can be seen behind the people. With Viji's shot, this is just lovely. I mean, it's a lovely shot, and I remember you sent it in once before. We straightened it a little bit, but that notion that you're just looking at a world, to capture it like that, I think was just a really lucky shot, and it's very nicely done. But even though it is actually everybody in a straight line and fairly flat, the fact that it's silhouetted, we've got the depth of what's going on behind them, and actually the silhouette is what's giving us all these faces. We can see the interaction of who's facing who's talking, who's sort of sitting thinking to themselves, who's involved with other people and who isn't. This one here, I quite like. We've got a sort of slightly, there is a containment within this. You've got the curve here, the curve here. This guy looking at the camera does mean it's automatically, our attention is completely drawn to him and everything else is happening around him. Now, if that isn't what you wanted, if what you really wanted was everybody looking at the phone, then yes, this guy sort of wrecked the photo. It works well because she's pointing at it, he's looking down at it, he's looking down at it, he's not. But as a photo about him within the group, that works quite well. This one, I think, it's just fun because, hey, it's, parents and grandchildren and grandchild, and it might not be the perfectly composed photo, but it's about who was there. And it's about this event happened at that time with these people. And very often a group photo, that's what you're really ultimately hoping for. So hopefully then, there's a lot of information in there. Hopefully though, that gives you an idea of group photography. Your key things with group photography, in terms of composition, what we're talking about is the notion of containment, of diagonals, mixing up the heights, trying to break up that notion of the flat line, and leading lines, drawing the eye in and out of the picture. And psychologically, what we're talking about is the notion of trying to understand that some people are always going to try and hide, some people really don't want to be there. If you need them to be in the picture, you need to let them know they need to be in the picture, and you need to let them know that if they can't see the camera can't see them, and then they're not going to be in the picture. And you need to allow some people to just stand at the back, but do your best to make sure they are at least poking their head through the gap between something else. So hope that's a lot. There's a lot in this, and maybe you'll need to kind of come back and flick through and try and get some ideas again. But hopefully that's giving you an idea of group portraits. It is a pretty big subject, and don't worry, I'm not going to set a group portrait challenge. Right, okay, so quick little reminder then, if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, you feel you've gained anything out of anything I've been telling you today or over the last 199 episodes, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can help support these podcasts. Now, last thing now I want to talk about is next week. Okay, don't rush off. Next week is the 200th episode. 200. I never thought in a million years I would ever get to 200 episodes of these podcasts. So what I want to do in terms of celebration is I want you to send me photos. Now last week I said send me your best photo of the last 4 years. I meant to qualify that. Okay, what I want you to do is send me either the best photo, your favourite photo that you've submitted, either whether in a challenge or anything else, to these podcasts in the last 4 years, or the best photo you feel has been influenced by these podcasts. Okay, so it's the 200th podcast, so the podcast needs to be a kind of central part of the theme of the photo that you put in. Okay, so either a photo your favorite photo you've submitted over the past 4 years, or a photo you've created which you feel has been influenced by or helped by or assisted by, or something you've learned from and applied to the photo and you're pleased with it. So send me your images and tell me about the image. Tell me why it is you like it. Tell me in what ways this podcast has helped you. It's useful for me to know that, I come here week in, week out, giving you all this information, and it would be nice to know that it's having an effect. It'd be nice to know that people feel that they're genuinely benefiting from what I do, and that it's not just me really kind of talking to myself with a couple of people eavesdropping in occasionally. So if you feel these podcasts have helped or influenced you in any way, influenced your photography, then send me the image. And next week will be a celebration of that. But tell me a little bit about it. Don't just send me the image. Send me the image with a little bit of blurb and tell me what it is about these podcasts that you've enjoyed or has helped you develop your photography or has influenced the photo that you're sending in. Okay, right. Well, this was a kind of longer, much more intense kind of information than I thought it was going to be, but I hope you feel you've gained something out of it. Right. So that pretty much brings us to an end. Thank you ever so much to Viji for coming up with the whole idea in the first place. Sorry, wrong one. For coming up with the idea of the group portraits. Thank you to both to Viji and to Sandra for sending in images. That kind of gave us the launch part to get the whole podcast going to talk about. And thank you to you for turning up, leaving comments, saying hello, being a part of this. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.